Hello, my name is Andy Brown. I'm the editor of International Construction Magazine, and I'm joined today by Chris Sleight, the Managing Director of Off-Highway Research. Chris, thank you very much for your time. I hope you're well.
Yeah, very well. Thanks for having me, Andy.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. So today we're going to be talking about China. So China's been such a strong market for construction equipment sales the last couple of years. I wonder, Chris, could you just give us an outline of, just how high sales have been and kind of maybe put this into context compared to some other markets?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing to say about China really over the last 10 or 12 years is it feels like it's either been up or it's been down. So the sort of the recent history was, well, not so recent now, 2010 and 2011, you had a huge peak from stimulus spending. Then you had a very long recession until about 2016. Then from 2017, the One Belt, One Road infrastructure initiative kicked in, and that took sales up to, a pretty healthy level. We're talking about 350, 375,000 machines per year in that period. And we at Off-Highway Research felt, yes, that's a more natural level for China. It's not as low as it's been recently, but it's not where things were in 2010, 2011, where there was a bubble. So things were ticking along fairly nicely up until 2019, and we felt things had peaked and there'd be a sort of a soft landing and fairly stable conditions thereafter. Of course, COVID changed all that for every market in the world. China's reaction was sort of slightly different. So in 2020, in March and April, a lot of stimulus spending came in pretty much straight away, and the market shot up in 2020. That lasted for a year. The first quarter of 2021 was remarkable. I mean, really quite stunning volumes, and that kept 2021 as a year as a whole quite high. And then the market fell away. I think, what's been striking this year is that the market has fallen away a lot more steeply than we previously anticipated.
Okay, could you kind of maybe give us a bit more information about kind of how far it's fallen, and are there any particular equipment types that have been more affected than others?
Yeah, sure. So in comparing the first half of 2022 to the first half of 2021, the market has halved, more or less. Obviously, the market was artificially high in 2021, but we certainly didn't expect that kind of downturn. What we're forecasting for the year as a whole is still a fall of about, high 30s, 38% or so compared to last year. So that's going to take the market back down, probably below what you would consider a natural level. So it's definitely not a soft landing. It's a real collapse. Why is that? Well, there are two sort of major events in China this year. First of all, in the first half of this year, there were a lot of COVID restrictions reimposed, and that's all been widely reported. You're not really meant to call them lockdowns, but they were lockdowns, and they were pretty strict. And obviously that really constrains the Chinese economy and the amount of economic activity that can go on. So that's certainly been a problem. The bigger one, which is a little bit more specific to construction equipment, is all the problems that are happening in the Chinese real estate sector. So obviously it's very well publicized that Evergrande, the world's biggest real estate company and as I understand it, the world's most indebted company, with when things started to go wrong, it had about 300 billion US dollars of debts on its books, has obviously had a lot of problems in servicing those debts, and that's caused a lot of concern about bad debts throughout the Chinese real estate sector. So it's coming at a point where housing sales are falling quite steeply. Prices are even falling in China, which is something very new for that market. So yeah, I mean, obviously that's something that's going to take time for all the debts to restructure. I don't think it'll be a sort of a chaotic collapse. I don't think the Chinese government would let that happen. But obviously, it's going to take time for it to shake out, for housing prices to kind of renormalize and reset. And while that's going on, you know, people just aren't going to be building new houses, or they're not going to be building them in the sort of numbers that they were before. So obviously that has a big impact on construction equipment sales.
Mm-hmm. And do you think off highway, in terms of the next couple of years, is it going to be the sales are going to increase from the low that you've predicted? And do you think it'll increase marginally? Will it be a case of kind of maybe a couple of years of falling sales and then a couple of years of marginal increases?
What we're forecasting at the moment is another fall in 2023, although obviously not as steep as we're seeing this year, and things probably bottoming out next year, and maybe a bit of improvement in 24, and then a sort of a more gradual climb back. I think for the medium term, we would still say sales are going to be below their natural level, what they should be in China. And that's a function of, as I said, you know, these problems in the real estate sector are not going to be better overnight. It's not going to be a disaster, but it's going to take time for it all to shake out and for pricing to reset. I think the other thing to probably mention is that, you know, obviously the Chinese government is aware of the problems it has and is reacting to them, and it is introducing more stimulus measures right now as a result of that. As in 2020, the main mechanism for that is allowing the provincial governments to raise more debt through special bond issues, and then that money has to be spent on infrastructure. I think the concern that we have about that is just the sustainability of those provincial governments taking on more and more debt. So I think there is a question about how much impact that's actually going to have in terms of the construction activity, and then also feeding through into construction equipment sales. You've had this huge boom in the last couple of years. So there are a lot of very young machines sitting around in China not doing as much as they were. Mm-hmm. So even if construction activity picks up, it's not necessarily going to trigger more sales because there's plenty of equipment around already.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Well, my final question really would be, obviously, as we've touched on, China's been such an important market for construction equipment sales for a couple of years now. I guess kind of wider what this might mean for the kind of global construction equipment market, and for the OEMs that have maybe kind of done quite well with China for a couple of years. Would we expect kind of global sales then to kind of also suffer due to what's going on in China?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, at a global level, you know, China right up until this year and for the last 4 or 5 years was by far the biggest market in the world. So the kind of fall that we're talking about in China is obviously something that you see in the global headline figures. So global equipment sales will fall this year. As a result of that, we think the global market will be down 7% this year. And that is mostly due to China, although for most markets, they're kind of coming off last year's peak, and you know, not many places are still growing this year. So there's a general sort of plateauing around the world. In terms of what it means for the industry and the manufacturers, I think the first thing to say about China is pretty much every machine sold in China is made in China, and that goes for the indigenous brands and also the international OEMs that have set up there. So obviously the kind of collapse in demand that we're seeing in China does have big implications for those factories. And you know, bear in mind that the factories in China are sort of tens of thousands of units of capacity. So when the demand suddenly halves, you've got a lot of spare capacity that you suddenly need to find a home for. Those factories do also feed emerging markets, and with commodity prices being so high at the moment, that has been something of a saving grace, because emerging markets are pretty much at a record high at the moment. So that is taking some of the capacity that is not going to China and you're seeing those machines being sold in the Middle East or Latin America or some of these hotspots. So that is saving things a little bit. But, I think fundamentally, you still have a lot of manufacturers in China that are stuck with too much capacity. So I think you're going to see, particularly for the bigger indigenous OEMs, they are going to start looking more seriously and putting more effort into export markets, including developed markets like Europe and North America. I think the interesting dynamic there is that in Europe and North America, because of all the supply chain and transportation shortages we've had, a lot of the traditional suppliers, they're sold out for months and they just can't meet demand. We have definitely seen in what we look at in market shares that Chinese OEMs have picked up market share, particularly in Europe in the last year. So clearly there's an opportunity for them to keep doing that for the next 6, 9, 12 months. So it is going to heighten competition, but then if a bigger downturn comes, all these sort of slightly unnatural pressures will unwind a little bit. And I think the challenge there for the Chinese OEMs is, can they really hang on to that market share when these bigger, more muscular international competitors are kind of back to normal operation, and they're backed by these big distribution networks that have been in place for decades. So it's going to be interesting to watch and kind of see how it all plays out. But of course, it's what happens in the market, what happens with demand is driven by so many things that are unknown and unknowable. It's about what happens with inflation, what happens with interest rates, what happens with the war in Ukraine. It's not an easy job being a forecaster these days.
No, harder than ever before, I imagine. Well, that's perfect, Chris. Thank you so much. That's such an interesting overview on China and what that might mean as well in terms of kind of worldwide sales and that dynamic between the OEMs. So thank you very much for your time, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Andy. Thank you for having me.